To discuss the latest developments in the Syrian conflict and the best way forward for the war-torn country, we're joined by our three guests. In London, Haitham Sabahi, a Syrian political activist who supports the Syrian government. In Washington, D.C., Faisal Itani, a fellow with the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. And here in the studio in Doha is Louay Safi, a senior member of the Syrian National Coalition. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on Inside Syria. Welcome to the program. Louay Safi, if I may start with you. Regime troops have raised their flags over the municipality of Babila after agreeing a truce with local fighters there. Do you believe these rebels are betraying the revolution by agreeing to these truces?
We do understand the difficult circumstances they live in. They are under tight, inhumane siege that doesn't allow of anything, including food, water, and medicine to get in. So they had, after long months of siege, they had to find a way to get some support from outside. Mm-hmm. But we believe that these truces will not last for long, because unless they are part of an overall agreement, which is the regime is not willing to do, unless this is part of an agreement to end all all violence in Syria, then this will not live for long. These
truces certainly make the Syrian government look stronger, puts them in a stronger position. They're calling it reconciliation, in fact.
That's true, because the Syrian regime tries to portray itself as in control. It really has no control. It has too many militias that came from outside that they are calling the shots.
They can say the same thing about the Syrian opposition, can't they?
That's true. In the opposition also we have too many groups. But the difference is that this chaotic situation was produced by the regime as a way to keep power and to justify the use of violence. Okay. But in actuality, what we see is destruction and killing going on year after year. Now we are completing the third year.
Okay. Haitham Sabahi, in London, by signing these local truces with fighters in areas around Damascus, does this mean the Syrian government isn't interested in dealing with the political opposition anymore and would rather just simply deal with the fighters on the ground?
Let me say something. The fighters on the ground calling the shots. And Mr. Safi and his group, the SNC or whatever left from the CNC, they're always waiting for what those fighters have to decide. The Reconciliation Department is working hard in Syria, and if I may say so, it's not only in Babila. It happens in Barza, in Muaddamiyeh, it happens in some area in the south of Syria, in Daraz area, Al-Hara. It happens in many places. We have to, after the falling of the project, or what was pushed on Syria from the outside, we have to save those Syrians. We don't mind. We are very happy for the reconciliation and agreements on the ground. Right. We have to save those Syrians from the last collapse. The last collapse, it means those Syrians, they're going to result to some sort of desperate act.
Let me just point out, the Syrian regime is calling these deals a reconciliation, but the opposition and the fighters who actually agree to these deals say it's just a temporary truce. Faisal Itani in DC, let me ask you this. How much does this strengthen the position of the Syrian government? Do you think the signing of these local truces mark a new phase in this war in Syria? Could this perhaps signal the beginning of the end?
No, I don't think so. I think these truces are exactly what they look like, which means they're a result of the relative effectiveness of the regime's siege and starvation strategies of these areas held by the opposition. Now, the regime picks its battles very carefully, and it usually concentrates on those battles it thinks it can win. They've obviously
but they're certainly winning the battle right now on the ground. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I wouldn't agree. I would agree that where they choose to concentrate firepower and manpower, they tend to do well because they have superiority in firepower. But if you're judging the outcome of the war on the whole, no, it's much too soon to tell in whose favor it will go on the balance. And it also depends how the respective parties define their victories.
Okay. Louay Safi, some of the fighters who signed these truces in Muaddamiyeh, in Babila, for instance, say they were forced to accept this deal because the Syrian opposition hasn't delivered. The Syrian opposition isn't helping them on the ground. What do you respond to that? Is the Syrian political opposition still relevant today when those fighting on the ground don't seem to trust and respect you anymore?
Well, I mean, it's true that these deals have been a force on the opposition in those areas because of the siege, which is, by the way, is starving people to submission, which is in violation of international law. But ultimately, the situation in Syria is going to solve through political solution. The regime will not be able to win after 3 years.
But you haven't been able to obtain politically what the groups on the ground have been asking for. I mean, Geneva too was a failure. So on the ground, it's not working militarily, and politically, it's not working either. So there's very little faith right now in what your movement can achieve.
That's true, because we don't have strong outside support. I mean, look at the regime. It received full support from Iran and from Russia, while the opposition received sympathetic support and little support in terms of material and military support. So what's happening is that the fight is taking too long, but the Syrian people have no other choice. I mean, Syrians have no choice. They can't live with this regime that is ruled by criminals who have been attacking cities and towns. So they have to fight until there's a just solution. There's a solution that will give them the rights and then bring peace and tranquility.
So as far as the political opposition is concerned, what is now the way forward? I understand that the Syrian coalition has now agreed to rejoin, the council has agreed to rejoin the umbrella group of the Syrian National Coalition. What does that mean, and where do you go to from now?
Well, it means that there is a feeling that the opposition needs to consolidate both militarily and politically. We are doing so. The process has been slow because, remember, we started from scratch. This regime was mighty at the beginning, and now it is not able really to retake even the suburban areas within around Damascus. So it's taking longer, but the regime is going to fall. It tries to give more confidence to its supporters that it can last, but it will not be able to last because of the way it's dealing with the question of political solution. They are insisting on military solution, and military solution will not work out in Syria.
Okay. Haitham Sabahi, in London, is a political solution still possible as far as the Assad regime is concerned? Are they interested in still negotiating with the Syrian National Coalition?
Well, the Syrian government has called from 2011 for political solution, and it will not leave any little hope. It will go for it.
But a political solution also means compromise. What I'm asking is, are they willing to compromise on some of the things that the opposition wants, like the setting up of a transitional government that wouldn't include Bashar al-Assad?
Well, Syrian government has compromised quite a lot since 2011. They had rewrote the constitution. They have a change of way. They accepted opposition inside the government. And by the way, now they're going to Geneva. Although we know Geneva, because the group were in Geneva on the other side, they were not representing all what you call it, all the sides or all the oppositions. They were representing whatever left from the SNC after a large number of the SNC pulled out. And what we want the Syrian government and the opposition to denounce violence and say it's enough for the violence, enough, we have to sit. But there is other elements on the Syrian ground. There is those Takfiris, there's the terrorists, there's Al-Qaeda group. And if the Syrian opposition want to stand with Syrian against such an elements, which is happening in the north of Syria now, in around Aleppo area, and Mr. Safi said the Syrian government is not controlling anything. The area is closing on them. The Syrian troops today is controlling all the routes to Aleppo from the suburb. They're controlling all the Kalamon mountains. The one is connecting with Lebanon. They clearing a lot on the south, and they are in a very good position. The army.
I think Faisal Al-Thani doesn't agree with you on that point. I think Faisal Al-Thani in DC doesn't agree with you on the point that the Syrian government is making big gains on the ground. You disagree with that, Faisal. So what then do you think is the way forward if either side is not winning this war?
No, just to clarify, I don't deny that the Syrian government has made some progress in those areas that it's prioritized. It's obviously, as we said, made some progress in the suburbs of Damascus, in some of the areas around Aleppo, he's right. And I'm not sure exactly what the outcome of the Qalamun fighting is quite yet. That seems to be a long-haul effort. But, you know, I mean, winning some battles and prioritizing some fronts at the expense of others doesn't mean winning the war. I think the regime simply lacks the manpower and resources to retake most of the country that's fallen out of its hands. And ultimately, the question is whether they'll settle for what they already have, and plus a little bit more or less on the margins. And if they do, then maybe they don't want to retake the entire country, to be frank.
Louay Safi, when you hear these numbers and the dire situation on the ground, what is your plan as far as improving it for Syrians? I mean, the Syrian opposition, you talk about a way forward, a transitional government. Beyond the wars, what are you going to do?
I think the only thing that will solve the problem is that the Assad regime will have to go. This regime, remember, it was opposed by very peaceful revolution. But used open fire and ultimately created this situation that we are in. Now we have embraced the solution that came up after many trials, which called Geneva Communique, setting up a transitional governing body. That will be named by two parties, and that will have authority, because political authority, because it will draw the support of the fighting forces. But the regime refused because they want the tyrant to remain in power. And that will not happen. The tyrant will have to go out, and the regime that
they're not willing
has
to negotiate
created
on that right now. So
let me remind you of one thing: that this revolution is fighting two wars. One against terrorism, Daesh, the SIS, which was created by the regime itself,
the ISIL, right?
The ISIS, yes, right. the Islamic State of
Iraq
and Levant. So we are fighting these two forces. We are fighting terrorism and we are fighting tyranny.
Which has considerably weakened the opposition.
It has weakened the opposition temporarily, but in the long run, the people would win. No tyrant was able to hold against the will of the people for long. They can hold for a while because of outside support, but the people will win, and the people have no incentive to really go back to the status quo ante.
Okay. Haitham Sabahi, what do you respond to that accusation that, in fact, that it's the Assad regime that's been fueling these al-Qaeda-linked groups like the ISIL, that's been backing them to further weaken the Syrian opposition?
Let me say something here. Mr. Safi has no right to speak on behalf of the governments or others, because they don't control these people. They went there to Geneva as just they repeated what Ambassador Ford did. They were just a parrot to repeat those words. They don't have influence on the ground. And that's what the Syrian government was trying to do in Geneva, to test if these people has influence on the ground. If they have an agreement, they don't have any influence. All the brigades, all these gunmen went against them, and they don't want them in Syria either. They don't represent many people, only they represent United States and their paymasters in Saudi. That's exactly the position at the moment. What we need all the opposition to be in Geneva. Everybody involved in the Syrian crisis to be there. The Syrian gunmen, there is reconciliation at the moment, but the other groups of the one from outside, like Daesh, like this fundamentalists and Al-Qaeda, who brought them in the first place? Who opened the borders for them, helped them on the borders with Turkey?
Okay.
Isn't the Free Syrian
Haitham
Army,
Sabahi,
isn't those politicians who
allow
is
Louay
crying
Safi
about
to
it
respond
now?
to what you have to say.
Yeah, I think this game of who represents who is a game that the regime has liked to engage in. Ultimately, who the government represents? A government that chooses forces to stay in power.
Us, the majority of the Syrians.
Let me complete my question, my answer.
Please.
If a government represents anybody, then why is killing people, fighting people to stay in power? But the issue is not here. Now, we came to Geneva because the coalition was invited as the government, and the government came. We came there. But what they didn't want to do is to establish a governing body that will pave the way for transitioning Syria into democracy away from dictatorship, because the dictator did not give them permission to negotiate the transition. And unless we can force the dictator, and of course Sabahi is a mouthpiece of the dictator, now talking about our, our ability to speak on behalf of the people. Unless the dictator is forced to come to the negotiating table, then I think the situation will continue as it is in Syria.
Okay, what do you see the U.S. doing? Do you anticipate a change in U.S. policy where they could possibly provide arms to the opposition?
Now, what we are asking at this point is that the regime has to feel the impact of what they have done. They have rejected a peaceful track to transition to democracy. They're insisting on keeping this one man over the Syrian people, regardless of how many people he has killed. So unless we come into that, so of course we would like the international community to come behind us. And if that takes arming the opposition in a way that it can win the fight, I think they have a moral obligation, because the alternative is a regime that is willing to kill and rape and control the population
when you say a moral obligation, what does that entail?
Moral obligation here is the Syrian people rose up for freedom, for democracy. And they asked the entire world to give them support, but rather they have seen giving a cold shoulder for too long. And now the regime has been killing with impunity. They feel these guys in Damascus, they feel they can kill anyone who opposes them with impunity.
You say the Syrian people, but there are those like Mr. Haitham Sabahi in London who still support this regime today.
I think, the Syrians, by and large, are voted with their blood. I mean, look at the opposition. Millions of people are opposing this dictator. And even if he didn't kill anybody, he should go. But now there are people either benefiting from the situation or fearful of the future. I don't know where Mr. Sabahi stands. I have to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Mr. Sabahi, you have the last word then. Where does the future stand? Where do you see Syria heading?
Yeah, this is the point. We always talk about a political solution between all the Syrians. The other side talking about they should be arming and fighting all the way. In politics, you sit on the table, you talk, you lose the points, you win the points. You don't X somebody else. This is, if the Syrian government is strong, the opposition has to sit with it and have a dialogue and win some points and lose some points, not keep their ears to outside. Outside is not going to help them. They have tried this for the last 3 years, and what the outside did, they took their interest, they carry out their interest, and they using these people left and right. This opposition at the moment, and what we saw in Geneva, it is just they're implementing the international policy, and they change their skin colors exactly how the international policy goes.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you very much indeed for being on this edition of Inside Syria. Louay Safi here in Doha, Haitham Sabahi in London, and Faisal Itani in DC. Thank you all. Thanks for watching Inside Syria. Goodbye for now.